Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you all are doing well. So now that Clive has shared her research, and now that Yeeva has shared his experience, and now that Shay has translated, I'll be talking about our organization, AIDCI, and what we're trying to do in the future now that all of these stories are starting to really come to the surface. Now to begin, AIDCI, again, it stands for the Association of India Delhi Camp Internees, and it was formed quite recently in 2010. So the group is fairly new, and it's actually very unique in that it's made up of ex-internees mostly, and many of these internees, you think about it, they went to the camp, they were released, they struggled after losing their education, their business, their property, their family members, and so they quietly started rebuilding their lives. And after coming to Canada, they were still very quiet about it. So now that most of these members are, a lot of them are now like 60 years and older, they are starting to begin a movement. And so, as any organization, we have challenges. And the greatest challenge that we are having currently is raising awareness. So why is it difficult to raise awareness for any kind of social movement? And the main thing is that people don't want to hear about it because it doesn't relate to them, because it didn't happen to them, and because it's not going to benefit them in any way. So I'm here today to make things a little less distant for you. I know this subject is very distant because I don't know anybody else who has experienced the camp. Is anyone in this room, do you have friends or family members who are in the internment camp? Yes. Okay, so we have quite a few people. And so we have quite a few people who were in the internment camp. So I'm here today to kind of close that gap so that we can kind of see what this organization is about. And for a while, I'm going to explain about how I myself got involved in AIDCI. Because as you can see, I'm not a senior citizen. So people ask me, how did you get involved in AIDCI? You're clearly not old enough to be an internee. And I tell them, I was kind of born into it because my own father he's an ex-internee. Now, the catch is that he was interned when he was only 6 years old, so I can't remember what I did yesterday while I was here, but I can't remember what I did like last week, so obviously he doesn't remember what he did, his life when he was 6 years old. He just remembers the life was very hard after the internment camp. And so, I spent a lot of time trying to ask him questions, trying to find out about the camp, but he couldn't answer them for me. And so finally, when I was 16 years old, I came to Canada, and I came to a reunion for the camp survivors and friends, and that's actually where I met Clyde. That's where I met a lot of my family members for the first time. I should have mentioned earlier that I'm actually from the U.S., so I grew up in a town where it's all Americans. I'm one of the only Chinese kids in the schools. So, I was completely isolated. And so once I came to Toronto, I started getting interested in this group. At that time, AIDCI hadn't even formed yet. Many of the members were just, they would do casual meetings, and they would have silent anniversaries. And it wasn't until later they formally had an organization. And so that same year, I also went to India. And that was the first time that I've ever felt blatant discrimination and microaggressions. Is anyone else here from India? Okay, so we have quite a full house here of Chinese Indians. All right, and a lot of you can probably relate that, like, when you go down the street, a lot of times you're called a chink. People will say ching tong after you, and it's really, really humiliating to have to experience that day to day. And you really do feel harassed. And I had never felt anything like that before. I mean, I grew up in small town America where, yeah, I got bullied sometimes for being Chinese, but this was just blatant. And there was nothing that was protecting a lot of people. To date, AIDCI, that's where I want to point out the goal of AIDCI right now, is that we want a formal apology from the Indian government to the ex-internees so that this event, that this internment does not happen again. And so we also we hope for compensation to these families, but primarily we are concerned about a formal apology so this doesn't happen again and again. And so after I left India, I really had this goal in mind. I really wanted to do something, but I didn't know how. And so, years passed, and I found myself in college. And by this point, I still hadn't done anything. I was just thinking about all of this. And so one day I happened to run into a professor, and he studies Hakka people. And he came to know that I am Hakka. And so he asked me about my story, and I sat down with him and told him about my father's side of the family. And when he heard all of it, he finally sat back and said, "You need to write all of this down." Because I've never heard of all of this. I didn't know that it happened. I'm sure a lot of people don't know it happened. If you don't do anything, this community is going to fade out, and nothing will be done. There will be no forgiveness. There will be no protection for these people. And so some time passed. He started pushing me to write, and he eventually offered to write a paper with me, and we're going to present it in Beijing. Now, I started interviewing people in Canada last winter, and when I was interviewing people, I heard tragedy over tragedy as people told me about how they lost their family members, as people died in the camp, as some people starved. Most people lost their education. They couldn't go back to school. And after that, lives just completely fell apart. There are so many people who are in India today, they're still impoverished as a result of the 1962 internment. Luckily, there's a community today that is still strong, and they're trying to do something about it so this doesn't happen again. After hearing story after story, you can't just stand back and think of this as a scholar, just write down the stories for myself, for my own accomplishment. I can't just do that. I have to share it with people, and I want something to be done about this. And so this is probably, I'm going to share a story with you guys so that this sticks with you. And the story I got while I was interviewing one woman, and I asked her a question. And the question was, while you were in the camp, did you know anyone who had died while they were in the camp? And she thought for a moment, and she said, "Yeah, I do remember a little girl that I used to play with." And I said, "How did she die?" And she said, "The little girl was buried alive." And when I heard those words, I thought, clearly this must be just a rumor, but I didn't say anything, and I just let her continue. And so she continued her story, and she said, "Yeah, this little girl that I knew, I used to play with her, she was a perfectly healthy girl. There were no health problems in the past. And one day she happened to just fall sick. It was nothing too major, it was just a minor sickness, but they sent her to the hospital. And this was the camp hospital, so it didn't have the most professional doctors. And one doctor was okay. The other doctor, everyone kind of knew that she was not qualified. And it so happened this poor little girl was given over to the doctor who was not qualified. And so what happened was the doctor tried to treat this little girl, and finally she diagnosed the girl and said, "This girl is dead." And without giving her a proper autopsy, the girl was laid in a coffin, closed up, and buried. Later on, some time passed, maybe a few hours, and a guard, or a camp official, was passing by the grave, and he heard crying and screaming coming out from the ground. And it had to have been that little girl. And so, if you hear something coming out from the ground, you would have the compassion to do something, right? This man simply walked by and did nothing to help this girl. Until 3 days later, they buried up the coffin, they opened it, and there was an odor. And they could see from the girl's face that it was distorted and that this girl had suffocated to death. When you hear a story like this, you know, it's hard to forget it. You can't forget it. I remember when I first heard this story, it was really hard to not just break down and sob. And I think that this story is really representative of the entire 1962 incident. When you hear that something terribly wrong can happen, it's one thing to inflict pain upon a person, but it's another thing completely to hear about this and do nothing to help people. Just as that policeman had walked by that little girl's grave and did nothing to help her. The 1962 internment was not a rumor. It definitely happened. It was very real. And there are thousands of people who suffered in that camp. This is only one story that we know of among the thousands. And I'm asking you all today to please support AIDCI and just do not let this incident, this historical incident, ever be forgotten. This moment that we're in right now is actually historical. This is one of the first times that people such as Yeeva has shared his story with the public. Many people are still very sensitive and they don't want to talk about this, and I'm asking you all to please hear their stories, to please support us. I'll have a slide up in a few minutes with our contact information, and just please, by the end of the day, tell someone else about what you've heard today. Tell them about our organization, and please stay in contact with us. Please support us. This is, you know, it's really a historical moment for us. And I want to thank you all for listening, for your time. I know we're over time, but thank you very much.
I have Yeeva load up her slides, and then we'll just go, just a few slides, about 7 or 8 slides I think it is. We'll just run through them very quickly, and then in the meantime, I'll open it up for questions. There's Mr. Wong there,